Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Legatum Institute and to the Cultural Prosperity Programme, and to this, the latest in a series of lectures devoted to the history of capitalism. And in this, the third year of its syllabus, we're looking at the history of particular cities and urban regions in that history. And Catherine Schenk is here to talk about Hong Kong, the context of laissez-faire. A great friend of mine, very large, very masculine friend of mine, who made a great name for himself in the history of Hong Kong recently, said to me, "I love Hong Kong." And I said, "But why?" It's the only part of the world, he said, where I can stand on the pavement and great big wads of notes come gushing up from beneath me. Putting to one side the rather alarming thought, a parallel between my friend Percy and Marilyn Monroe standing on the sidewalk in that wonderful film 7-Year Itch. Even without that alarming mental image, surely the history of Hong Kong is one of the most extraordinary aspects of the history of capitalism, indeed the history of the British Empire. It emerges, of course, out of the Opium Wars. Even those of us who rather admire the history of the British Empire look at the history of the Opium Wars with some trepidation, since we went to war in order to secure the continuation of the opium trade and to enslave people to a drugs trade. And then in the 1890s came the leasing of the new territories on that famous 99-year lease. And we were very lucky to be able to hang on to Hong Kong at all during the Second World War, because FDR, as president, took rather a dim view of the British Empire and wanted to keep us out of Hong Kong, and take the British out of Hong Kong. Then we came back, and then came this extraordinary period, 60s, 70s, and 80s, that Catherine is going to be talking to us about. She speaks with a rare and unique authority on the history of the colony, as an economic historian, as a business historian, and now as a luminary among the historians of the great University of Glasgow, whose distinctive spire is there to be seen among us. We're looking forward very much to her original reassessment of Hong Kong, context of laissez-faire. Very great welcome to you, Catherine, this evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hugh, and I wanted to thank Mary also, but thank the Institute for the invitation to address you, and for you all coming out on a kind of a dreich, as we would say in Scotland, a dreich Friday evening to hear about a rather sunny and tropical clime. This is the sunny and tropical clime of Glasgow, which I left looking just like that, believe it or not. It was hot and sunny. I thought I'm going to have to put a coat on to come down to London. But we turn our minds now to the history of Hong Kong. And just a quick refresher for those who aren't so familiar with the East, the Far East, and the really strategic position that Hong Kong played in the global trade networks of the 19th century, which really is the kind of foundation of the whole presence of Hong Kong and the reasons for its very existence. As Huel has introduced, the whole basis of Hong Kong was to allow the British traders and also American traders to escape the clutches of Canton and the Chinese administration, imperial powers, and develop a more open and trading and competitive environment for that really crucial international trade flow between East and West. So there was the trade with China, but also the regional trade in Southeast Asia. So we think about, I know that the theme, the overarching theme of the series of lectures that have been held at the Institute is about the nature of capitalism and what we are understanding by capitalism. Perhaps are there different kinds of interpretations. And Hong Kong has a particular place, I think, to play in the history of capitalism and also in our current understanding of what capitalism is. The sort of traditional story about Hong Kong is all based in the nascent 19th century sort of explosion of capitalism in the first globalization of the 19th century. Its origins in imperialism, in the trade and the trade-driven imperial expansion, particularly of the British Empire, but also of others. The commitment that we see or we interpret in the British colonial administration and also in subsequent administrations to open markets and free markets and letting the market reign and being entrepreneurial and being responsive to having a small government presence and allowing business to flourish, to make choices, and that the basis of Hong Kong's prosperity is built on this particular attitude, a particular openness, a particular embrace of the ideas of capitalism that were part of its founding. The sort of the topsy-turvy time in the post-war period that I'm going to talk about in the 1940s to the 50s, 60s, 70s, and into the 1980s, surviving the blockade after the People's Republic of China was founded, and then the embargo by the United States imposed immediately, and then the United Nations embargo on trade that followed up with China, so that suddenly the whole basis of Hong Kong's economic presence seemed to be threatened. But the resilience with which the entrepreneurs and the traders and the producers and the population dealt with a series of blows, not just that one in the 1950s, but also Britain imposing tariffs on Hong Kong manufacturers in the 1960s and 1970s, the reemergence of China into the global economy in the 1970s and 1980s, the rivalry with Singapore, the rivalry with Shanghai. I first started going to Hong Kong in the 1990s, and back then they're all saying, when is Shanghai going to be overtaking Hong Kong? How many years does Hong Kong have to last? And people are still asking those questions, of course, another decade and a half on. The other sort of idea about Hong Kong is that the Hong Kong people are really much more interested in business. They're much more interested in particularly small business, but also kind of making their way in the world. They're more interested in markets and not so interested in their democratic and social rights. That the primacy of the ideas of Hong Kong really has put business over politics in its evolution. So these are all kinds of ways that I think Hong Kong really plugs into ideas of capitalism. And of course, the huge success story that Hong Kong posed. So here we have two images. They're not quite the same, but if you look at the profile of the mountains, you can kind of see they're from similar, if not quite the same sort of perspectives. So you have Hong Kong in the 1890s. And Hong Kong, maybe 2015, maybe a little bit earlier than that, but certainly you've got the IFC towers up there. And you can see that how much of the reclamation of the harbor has happened, and that huge transformation of Hong Kong into the kind of skyline that is emblazoned everywhere, that is instantly recognizable with the huge tower blocks and the aggressive and exciting expansion of the city as a financial center in particular. So it's not only engaged and founded on these principles of capitalism in the first globalization, but also seems to be an important symbol of the success of those principles of capitalism in the longer term. Okay, so Hong Kong's success, it's all out there. It's not just in the image of buildings, although interestingly as that is. Certainly in terms of trade and growth per capita, the transformation of the economic structure I'm going to talk about a bit in the 1980s, I think, is one of its most stunning successes. And then growing the international financial center into what it is that we know today. And there's a range of different kinds of explanations that are put forward for its success. Part of it has to do with some of the colonial institutional legacy, the rule of law, political stability, the legacy of English language, which allows it to engage in global business. Its geographical location, which I spoke about first, in the Fragrant Harbor, which is Hong Kong's initial basis for existence. But also these ideas of open markets, the low tax burden, the low regulatory burden, and then the growing links to mainland China as the Chinese economy really took off from the 2000s onwards. And these is what we're going to explore today. So I'm going to show you some graphs. I'm kind of obsessed with graphs, and I'll just, but I'll try not to punch too many in. They're all kind of together. I think it's important when we're talking about countries, and we're talking particularly about long periods of time, that we have some kind of real evidence to kind of pin our ideas on. That to say that something grows and grows really fast isn't really enough. And economic historians spend a lot of time trying to pull apart the data to make it either of a higher periodicity, or trying to see trends and trying to analyze that data in order to pull something more out of it than just it grew real fast. And I think here we're looking at Hong Kong's per capita GDP. And you see that dramatic growth, particularly from the late 1970s. Do I have a... yeah. Here from when China opens, of course, you suddenly get a kind of a real takeoff and you get into an exponential sort of looking growth. And again, this is per capita GDP, which is a really important part of the sharing of prosperity in the country as a whole. It's hit very hard by the 1997 Asian financial crisis, and per capita GDP actually falls for a few years. There's the SARS crisis that people seem to have forgotten in terms of a pandemic. That was threatened during that period, that disrupted that open markets, that disrupted Hong Kong's global role. And then another dip towards the end of the graph with the 2008 global financial crisis. But a very successful sweep, interrupted only periodically. This is the year-on-year change, percentage change in gross domestic product, and this is in constant dollars, so it's kind of taking away all kind of the effects of inflation and changes in prices, if you like. It's going from 1961 to 2013, and you see it's really quite extraordinary. There's some kind of dips and some crises that I'll talk about in a moment, but what you're looking at here, that's 15% per annum. That's 10% per annum. This is 5% per annum. Okay. So really sustained, repeated, very high rates of economic growth, particularly in the 1960s. This is 65 and 66, 67, where Hong Kong became somewhat embroiled in the Cultural Revolution, and there was a threat to the growth there. This is the first oil crisis, 1973-74, and again, Hong Kong bears the symptoms of fluctuations in the global economy, again, because it's such so open and international economic relations are so important. But it recovers so strongly through the 1970s. This, again, is 10% per annum growth. Okay. Another little wobble here in the 1980s that we'll talk about. This is the time of the planning of the handover and Margaret Thatcher's and the British government's negotiations with Beijing over the handover and uncertainty. But it's all in the positive range until you hit 1997. Okay, and that's the dramatic change and sort of break, a very sharp and sudden impact from the regional Asian financial crisis. There was nothing really wrong with the fundamentals of the Hong Kong economy itself, but it was very affected by the regional crisis. And again, the only kind of large negative is the global financial crisis, okay, and recovery after that. So you can kind of eyeball it, and you can see you've got quite high rates of growth right here through until the 1990s, and then still, okay, more years than not, above 5%, except for those crises. And this is the Hong Kong unemployment rate. And again, we're talking about a period of labor-intensive production in the 1960s. And this is taking us from 1982 up to the present. And you can see that during this period of high-speed growth towards the end of the 1990s, unemployment actually falls. The impact of the Asian financial crisis, and then the sustained much higher rates of unemployment that are associated with the global financial crisis. Okay, we're coming to the end of the graphs, but this one I really want you to focus on. I think this is the most dramatic graph, and it's not only because it's in different colors and all that kind of thing. This, I think, is the real success story of Hong Kong. Its ability to reinvent itself from a manufacturing center to a global financial center. Okay. And we're not seeing just that the distribution or the shares of distribution of gross domestic products shift away from manufacturing, and then there's more of it goes to financial services and wholesale retail trade, tourism, all those other kinds of things. But actually that the absolute amount of what is manufactured in Hong Kong declines. Okay, so that's this black line down at the bottom. So you can see that at the start, this is 1980 at the start. They're all kind of rivaling each other, but really manufacturing is the dominant part of Hong Kong's economy. It remains in strong contention until 1990. And then from then, there's an absolute decline in manufacturing production in Hong Kong. It's not that it's a declining share, there's a decline in what's actually being produced. And this is the transformation of the Hong Kong economy as they shifted their manufacturing across the border to the mainland of China. So that the Hong Kong manufacturing, the Hong Kong companies are still manufacturing, but they're manufacturing across the border. And at the same time, they're lifting up their services sector really dramatically. Okay, so they're able to go through this transition that other countries have had challenges with, where you start with labor-intensive manufacturing, you have a lot of workers, and you have cheap labor, but gradually your labor becomes more expensive, and then you're kind of stuck because you lose your competitiveness. Hong Kong hit that point just when it was able to move its manufacturing across the border to another low-wage economy, and then shift their production or shift their economic activity into the global financial center without causing any kind of huge amounts of unemployment, without staggering their economic growth. Okay, and I think that's the really kind of dynamic and exciting story of Hong Kong's economic success. The other thing, of course, is the impact of the integration with the mainland and the great success that has been seen in the PRC economy. So this is from 1972. 1978 was the launch of the open door policy with Deng Xiaoping, and the gradual opening, closing towards international trade and international and market forces. And you can see this is the share of mainland China in Hong Kong's total trade dramatically increases. So that here I've got 2008, just at the time of the financial crisis, almost half of Hong Kong's trade is actually associated with mainland China. So in the process of this reconfiguring of the Hong Kong economy, there's also this intensification of the relationship with the mainland. And that was for trade. This is the Hong Kong stock market capitalization, and the proportion, the stat column is the proportion that is related to mainland Chinese companies. Okay, you can see that in 1993 it's pretty small, okay, below 10%. And by 2008, when the global financial crisis happened, it's getting towards 55% of the market capitalization of the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. So not only on the trade side, but also on the financial side, the integration with mainland China has been really very dramatic. Okay, what I'm going to focus on for the lecture is highlighted in red here. It's about some of the myths about how Hong Kong achieved some of these successes. And the explanations that I gave you are about, well, open markets and low tax burden, low regulatory burden, the links to mainland China. And I just wanted to challenge those a little bit over the next bit of the lecture. Okay, so first of all, the kind of myth of the free market paradise. It's consistently ranked as the freest economy in the world by the Fraser Institute, by the Heritage Foundation. Really, from the time that the records begin, Hong Kong is the benchmark. It's out there at the top consistently year after year after year, despite changes in its political, economic, and social, cultural kind of foundations. And in a sense, that's why Hong Kong matters to our understanding of capitalism, that it is this kind of benchmark. People see this as, well, you know, Hong Kong is so free, it's so far out there ahead, and it's been so successful. Milton Friedman really used Hong Kong as one of his models of free to choose and one of his models to promote free markets and freedom in the 1980s and again in the 1990s. So he had his TV program about free to choose. He had a whole kind of episode on Hong Kong. I think he used, when he was introducing Hong Kong, he used the word free like 12 times in a sentence, I think. You can see it on YouTube. I was going to try to get a clip in. But he was really also using this to contrast between Hong Kong, when it was still a colony, and the United Kingdom, which had a huge welfare state, which had very high government spending per GDP, which had very strong unions and was very slow growing, and for him unsuccessful during the 1970s. So it's this sort of contrast between the colonial power that seemed to have launched off in a different direction. He came back to it just before his death in 1997 and 1998, and again talking about the free market success of Hong Kong. He was particularly critical of the response to the Asian financial crisis when the Hong Kong Monetary Authority got involved in the stock market. Another kind of myth is that, well, Hong Kong developed because it was cut off from the mainland. The Communist Revolution happened, everybody put the embargo on China, and then suddenly the people in Hong Kong and the immigrants into Hong Kong had to readjust what they were doing, and so they rolled up their sleeves and they built their textile mills and they got going into manufacturing. And I'm going to show you that's not quite true. And the other aspect is about laissez-faire and this particularly Hong Kong phrase called positive non-interventionism. Okay, you might have to practice saying that to yourself. But it's this particular interpretation of Hong Kong, of the relationship between the state and the market in Hong Kong that is almost sui generis, but also very opaque and difficult to unpick. Okay, so the positive non-interventionism was devised by the financial secretary Philip Haddon Cave in the 1970s. And what he meant is that we're being non-interventionist, but we're positive that we're being non-interventionist, that it's a positive choice to be non-interventionist. It sounds kind of 1970s-ish, doesn't it? He did, however, acknowledge that there was a role for regulation in the case of particular and strong market failure. And this phrase, if you're not familiar with it, must just seem sort of arcane and why is she going on about this? But again, it's part of this identity of capitalism and the identity of the free market in Hong Kong that is really quite seriously embedded. The financial secretary, Hamish McLeod, said, oh, positive non-interventionism is over and we're just going to call it something else. But it stuck around. Donald Tsang in September 2006 again stood up and in a really kind of keynote speech said, no, positive non-interventionism is over. And now we have big market, small government. And again in August 2015, the current chief executive of Hong Kong again returned to no, positive non-interventionism is over. And again trying to position their government policy in this way. So this idea, this sort of complex idea, the different interpretations it can have has persisted from the colonial to the Chinese sovereignty. In 2006, it's formally been replaced by this another kind of slogan of big market, small government. Okay, I kind of wanted to introduce you a little bit to the kind of work that I do. I'm an archivally based historian, so I go into the archives of governments and banks and other financial institutions, and I look at all their internal correspondence and all the secret stuff that they think isn't so important anymore because it's so long ago. And I gather it up and I use it for evidence to interpret maybe what was going on underground and underneath the slogans or underneath the public idea of what was going on beyond the journalism of the time or even official stories of what was happening, to look for evidence through the documentation. And this, I'm not going to make you read it, obviously, but it's just to give you an idea. This is a letter from Philip Haddon Cave to Li Ka-shing. Li Ka-shing, if you have any context of Hong Kong, you will recognize the name, I hope. He's the most famous and richest businessman in Hong Kong today. He's a rags to riches story, and again, sort of emblematic of that evolution of Hong Kong. That's him on the top, and that's Philip Haddon Cave on the bottom. And he's thanking you very much on Betty and Francis's behalf for a delightful dinner last night in your most elegant house. I'm glad that you seem to be in good spirits and blah, blah, blah. But this is what he goes on to say. And this is towards the end of his tenure. So he kind of came up with the positive non-interventionism thing in the early 1970s. And this is sort of I think, quite a good encapsulated idea of what he meant, or at least what his position was when he was ready to leave office in 1981. And I think it's particularly important that it's something that he's saying to Li Ka-shing in the Hong Kong context. That the way in which so many in the marketplace, in these scratchy times, damn us even if we suggest something, and simultaneously damn us if we do nothing, is beginning to get me down. I'm determined for as long as I'm here to keep the economy and all the markets within it free. And that means free from unnecessary and clumsy government intervention, free from fiscal discrimination, free from the stifling effects of excessive taxation and an overlarge public sector, and free from all other influences which inhibit competitive forces. We'll see. Okay, so it's quite an important, it's a private sort of thing, but I think it then, because it's private, I think it speaks to what he felt he was trying to achieve. Did that actually reflect the reality of what it was he was doing? I don't think so. I think it reflects how people interpret positive non-interventionism and how people interpret the Hong Kong economic policy and economic policy stance, but I'm ready to challenge that. Okay, so challenging the myth. The first one I'm not really going to deal with, but it's this idea that Hong Kong people aren't interested in politics. They're only interested in business and getting rich, and money is all that matters in Chinese society. And this, you sometimes get this sort of rhetoric around rapidly growing economies. The recent rise in income inequality and the social and political unrest through the umbrella movement and other sorts of movements in Hong Kong, I think attest to some fracture, I hope, in that characterization of a people. More kind of economically, however, it's about non-interventionism and it's all free markets. Well, state controls the scarcest resource in Hong Kong. The scarcest resource in Hong Kong is land, and the government controlled it. They control it, the zoning, they lease it out, they decide what happens where, they say yes and no. Okay. They may not exercise that as well as they might all the time, but I think that's an important caveat to free markets. The second one is that the state subsidizes housing very, very heavily. At the moment, 30% of the people in Hong Kong live in public housing. And the public housing absorbs only about 6% of the budget, but that's only what they spend on it. The point about the subsidy is what they're not earning from it, rather than what they spend on it. So the rents in public housing on Hong Kong Island are 14% of the private sector rents, okay, the rental rates. And that's the private sector rents for flats that are less than 70 meters squared. So they're kind of really smallish, okay? So that's a huge subsidy to the cost of living for people in Hong Kong. It's a huge subsidy, therefore, for people who work in Hong Kong and the kind of wages they need to demand to live there. So indirectly, that's the state subsidizing industry. And particularly during this period of high-speed growth, which was based on labor-intensive manufacturing, I think that's an important subsidy to industry. The next one I wanted to talk about was about the integration with China. And this all kind of started, Deng Xiaoping came out and said, well, you know, the open door policy and a lot of the connections and the opening up of China to the global economy was rooted through Hong Kong in the same way that it still is today. And that this was sort of an important change and shift in Hong Kong's direction. But as a historian, I want to see more continuity. This is what historians are always looking for. We don't like abrupt changes, maybe. But I think, again, the integration, the economic integration between mainland China and Hong Kong before 1978 was also crucial to its economic development. Again, we're talking about labor-intensive manufacturing. We're talking about the need to have cheap labor, and that the cheap labor drove the industrialization of Hong Kong after the Second World War. About 30%, 15 to 30% of Hong Kong's imports were coming from the mainland China, and that was predominantly food, vegetables and meat. So they're getting cheap food imported into Hong Kong across the border, and that is what is keeping the cost of living low and allowing wages to be lower than they would otherwise have to be. So again, that integration with the mainland of China was really crucial and beneficial to the Hong Kong economy. There was a mutual symbiosis, if you like, even through the Maoist period and the Cultural Revolution and onward. The other aspect is a financial one, and I've got my last chart. You can all breathe a sigh of relief. And this is based on research that I've done. And it's about the financial importance of Hong Kong to mainland China before 1978, all the way through the Cultural Revolution, all the way through that period where everybody says, oh, well, China was just kind of out of the global economy and Hong Kong had to somehow make it on their own. And this is the amount of sterling that's being sold to Hong Kong on a monthly basis. And all you really need to know is that it's going up. It's starting in 1957 here at about 10 million pounds per month. Okay. In 1957. And it's rising here to, say, 50 million pounds per month. Okay, so where are they getting that? What they're doing is they're selling the food. They're selling some of their manufactures to Hong Kong. mainland China ran a very large trade surplus with Hong Kong, so they're earning Hong Kong dollars. Hong Kong has a free market in foreign exchange. They can exchange those Hong Kong dollars for sterling, which they need to buy their imports, because they're not allowed to use the US dollar. So that trade with Hong Kong that was so beneficial to the Hong Kong industrialization is also crucial for China's imports. Okay, it's essential imports, even during the period of self-reliance. And I've got just a kind of a note there that maybe only I can see, but it's equivalent to about 350 to 600 million pounds per month in today's money, okay, which is substantial, particularly at a time when mainland China was cut out of a lot of other kinds of global markets. Okay, so I hope I have convinced you at least that there is the isolation between Hong Kong and mainland China, the economic isolation, was not complete. And in fact, the integration between the two sides of the border was really quite crucial to the economic development and prosperity of both sides of that border in a much longer term before the open door policy. Okay, I want to spend a bit more time looking at the banking system, because that's what I know most about, perhaps. And it's certainly true that there was very slow and reluctant regulation of the banking system until the 1960s. And the records show the financial secretary, this guy, J.J. Cowperthwaite, very reluctant to get involved, just wants the banks to get on with it. Very kind of laissez-faire, let them do it sort of attitude. Unfortunately, this bred a lot of instability, and they had a series of banking crises in the 1960s where small depositors lost their money and banks went under and had to be rescued, particularly by HSBC and Chartered Bank. So there's repeated banking crises in 1961, and then they start to develop some banking regulation. You maybe need to avoid insider lending, maybe you need to pay and get a license, maybe in order to use bank in your name, you should be able to produce a balance sheet. So quite minimal sorts of regulation. I know, well, okay. They had to tack it up, at least outside their door. What happened in that kind of slow and reluctant and piecemeal, because just as the new regulations are announced, they have another rash of banking crisis, which is even worse, runs on banks, it's all kind of crazy, is that the depositors are bailed out ex post. Okay, the government bails them out. And this creates some moral hazard, particularly by those who own the bank. And some of the banks end up getting taken over by the government. This isn't something we think about in a laissez-faire free market paradise, that the bank would actually buy the bank, or that the government would actually buy the bank. That sounds like something that might happen in the UK or somewhere like that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the regulation. During the 1950s, 1960s, and even into the 1970s, foreign banks in Hong Kong were described as parasitic by the banking commissioner. They're strongly resisted by the incumbent banks, which are mainly HSBC, but also Chartered Bank, which is now Standard Chartered Bank. They hate them, and they kind of go on in their paperwork. They say, we have to make life as expensive and difficult for them as possible. They're not playing by the rules, particularly the American bankers they don't like, I'm afraid to say. So there's quite a lot of contestation about the International Financial Center. It's not kind of all open to welcome all comers and let's all play the game. They do, however, have open foreign exchange and gold markets, which is really important for Hong Kong regionally. But interestingly, the big offshore dollar market that emerges in the 1960s happens in Singapore because Hong Kong won't lift the tax on interest paid on offshore deposits. Okay, so they make a deliberate choice to use a tax instrument to push the offshore market into another center. Okay, during the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, there's draconian barriers to entry in the banking system. This is not a free market by any stretch of the imagination. And I've written quite a lot and investigated how these draconian barriers to entry came about, and they really are about the negotiation between the incumbent banks wanting to protect their competitive position and the government kind of being in slight thrall to them and worried about instability. So from 1965 to 1981, no new bank licenses can be made. No foreign banks, no domestic banks. moratorium, no entry at all. Even once that's lifted, there's limits on how many branches a new bank can have. It starts off at 1 and it goes up to 3 by 2001. So these are really quite tight restrictions on banking activity. Interest rates are set by a cartel from 1964 until 2001, interest rates on deposits. HSBC and Chartered Bank and a group of other little banks get together and they set the interest rates together. They don't compete for deposits until 2001. That's not a free market. There's no central bank, as we know, until 1993, and no deposit insurance isn't legislated until 2010, which is quite late. This is sort of the outline chronology of the bank regulation there. So the cartel starts in 1964, the interest rate cartel, and persists through. The moratorium on new bank licenses from 1965. In the archive evidence, there's quite a lot of lobbying from HSBC and other banks to say, well, we don't want any other banks to have any more branches either. We want to keep that business to ourselves. They don't get away with that one. Barclays comes in and kind of wants to be in Hong Kong in 1971-72. They can't find a good bank to buy. So they kind of lift the regulation, the moratorium, and allow Barclays in, and then put it back on again in 1978. Moratorium is lifted, but only one office is allowed in 1981. You get to have 3 offices from 1999, and then it's finally lifted in 2001. Okay, this is not a free market in banking to me. And this is kind of a fundamental part of Hong Kong's economy. So how do we explain it? I kind of hinted at it. There's the role of incumbent banks, particularly HSBC and Chartered Bank. There's quite a lot of evidence of regulatory capture. The archives are full of these negotiations between the Exchange Banks Association and the government, and between individual banks lobbying the government and this sort of thing. So they frame, they debate, and they implement the policy, and they amend it, policies, and they amend it quite a lot. The government's not very keen on banking supervision, and particularly in the 1960s and 1970s, they don't give the banking supervisor enough resources to go and inspect the banks. So the banks are not inspected, or they're inspected very late, or just on the basis of, well, here's our balance sheet. Tell us what you think, kind of thing. Okay, and this is a source of some frustration. I'll just show you just kind of a bit of evidence about that. So this is a letter to Haddon Cave in February, 2nd of February 1981, and it's complaining about the competition from non-bank financial institutions in the 1980s. And it goes on and on, as you can see, you know, this is terrible. It's, I know compromise is tempting as the easy way of life, but, you know, we need to kind of get to grips with this because it's impinging on our business and stuff in February 1981. This is the 9th of March, 1981, and it's from Philip Haddon Cave to Mike Sandberg at HSBC, so it's a kind of a reply. It speaks to their relationship. Dear Mike, as I was instrumental in landing 5 Haddon Caves on you at the Races on Budget night, I clearly ought to have written to thank you very much for being so tolerant and hospitable despite a simply dreadful hangover the next morning. And error this, but I haven't been too organized recently. Okay, so the social organizations and all this kind of stuff. I think it's interesting that it was budget night they took him out for a good time with his family. This is a quote. The banking commissioner by this time was called, in 1969, was a guy called Leo Cole, and he's really angry. There's all kinds of screeds of stuff in the archive. He's very, very frustrated because he's been given a job he can't do, and he's balked at every moment. Okay, so he doesn't have enough money to hire staff. He has to keep appearing before the finance committee and explain why he had to pay for an auditor to look at the books of this or that bank. He gets quite cross. And this quote says, if there are further questions or criticisms regarding the policy of my office, I will request the right to answer them in person insofar as there is nobody else qualified to do so. It's abundantly clear that there is a complete lack of comprehension or knowledge of the duties that my office performs. blah, blah. This is a point on which I've spoken to you many times in the past, on and on and on. I'm asking for an interview with His Excellency, the Governor, upon this last point. The time has come, in my opinion, to establish whether the colony's banking authority is to have the independence and status which it deserves or not. Not. Okay, he gets nowhere. And nothing in the end happens out of that. I won't go on, but this is just sort of more evidence. This is talking about, this is an internal, strictly private and confidential memo within HSBC about how the interpretation of the bank's relationship with the government. There's secret stuff in there that they don't want to have come out, but they have to manage that so they don't look like they're in each other's pockets, and it's all kind of hither and hither. Okay, so who cares? I mean, it's nice and gossipy, and the papers are fun, and the quotes are good, and then all that sort of thing. I think it matters because in the end, they become very vulnerable in the 1980s to a series of banking crises that are extraordinarily costly to the government and therefore to the Hong Kong taxpayer. But also challenge this idea of Hong Kong as a free market paradise. Let the markets prevail. There's no moral hazard here, and sink or swim, and it's all about entrepreneurship and choice. In this period, 7 banks fail, and another 100 deposit-taking companies go out of business. 3 of the banks are directly taken over by the government. So they're taken into government ownership, reformed using government resources, and then they try to split them up or sell them off. And the government offers financial support to try to tempt other private banks in to take over 4 more. Okay, so it's quite a substantial commitment. The causes of this are a combination of stuff, really fun stuff, check kiting, it's all going on, and strange stuff with people's mistresses, and it's very exciting stuff. But it's a combination of fraud, interlinked markets, so there's a lot of insider lending to themselves. There's quite a lot of history of, particularly in the 1960s, of difficulty discerning the difference between my family capital and my banks and customers' capital. Very, very poor supervision. So all this stuff is going on because the banks are not being well supervised. And they should be well supervised, particularly in Hong Kong, which is so vulnerable to asset market fluctuations. So the stock exchange and the housing market are both very volatile, and the banks get overcommitted to that, and so you're seeing a symptom. Okay, I am coming to a close. There we are. Okay, so Hong Kong is sort of just a little chip of the world, and I hope I've managed to convince you that's an important chip if you're thinking about capitalism and you're thinking about how we interpret capitalism and how we interpret free markets within that, and what laissez-faire means, and what it means to be the freest economy in the world. We need to unpick that a little bit and see how that changes over time and how context matters. I think that we need to beware the trade-off between a light regulatory touch and special interests capturing that process. And I think that's clear. So there's some checks and balances maybe needed, but then you're drawing in a tighter regulatory touch. So I think that balance sometimes tipped one way and sometimes the other way in Hong Kong. The banking system in Hong Kong was not freely competitive. It had really quite extraordinary barriers to entry that protected the incumbent banks. And I think that's a myth that needs to be dispelled. The other thing is about the heritage and the Fraser Institute assessments of what we think of as a free market and how we rank them. And I think we need to be very careful of helicopter views of policy environments. Because what it looks like on the tin, it's not like, I don't know, there's that paint or something. What it says on the tin is not necessarily what's going on in the inside. And what historians are able to do is unpick a little bit of that, looking at this sort of internal discussions. So I'm kind of making a case, I suppose, to try to clarify our understanding of these processes, of what we mean by free markets, whether they ever really exist, and what the implications are, how they may wax and wane, through a close, more historical treatment of capitalism or capitalisms. Thank you.